What is the future of Nintendo Directs? A few weeks ago, I dived into the specifics of a forthcoming Direct in terms of likelihood, and in this video, we're going to update things a bit, but also discuss more broadly the strategy Nintendo is taking with their Directs, the potential for other marketing options to come to the fore, and the tiers and tentpole structure that I think is governing Nintendo's approach at present. It's become a topic of discussion recently how general Nintendo Directs seem to have receded in frequency. Although Nintendo has continued to provide a goodly supply of indie worlds, partner showcases, Pokemon Presents, movie directs, game-specific directs, and more, the gold standard general Nintendo Direct that came at the audience with a medley of topics and news has become a rare sight in recent years. 2023 was the last year to have the February, June, and September showcases. That was, if not a wholly reliable pattern during the Switch's era, but was at least a default template to which they often reverted. 2024 had just one big blowout general direct in June, while 2025 did have three directs, but in the form of the double hitter presentations in consecutive weeks across March and April, followed by a third general direct in September. Alternatives to directs are something I've been musing about on this channel for a while. Back in October 2024, I made a video in which I observed that if Satoru Iwata was still around, he would probably be doing something around about now to give the Nintendo Direct format a kick up the backside, although I did expect a Switch 1 Direct in the early part of 2025. Sure enough, March 2025 saw a Switch 1 Direct, which also introduced the Nintendo Today app, a new way of communicating information, as Nintendo like to say, directly to you. And I've observed several times since then that I think this is something that Nintendo are going to continue to push in a big way, despite the response from much of the YouTube crowd being somewhere between apathy and consternation. After the major Switch 2 launch direct in April, I personally felt it very unlikely that we would see a June direct, and I was becoming skeptical about there being a September General Direct, expecting instead a Mario 40th Anniversary Direct instead, and not a full general presentation. Thinking perhaps I'd been too cautious on the prospects for Directs after there was indeed a September Direct, I went into this year thinking that they might want to go back to the 2023 structure after all of three full Directs in February, June and September once again, but as I reflected recently, I think my earlier judgment was probably right, just not quite at the right time. While Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave was certainly a big revelation last September, the fact is that the majority of the new game drops were in the Mario universe. Even Bonanza's DLC is what you might call Mario adjacent. In fact, Nintendo didn't need to do a big blowout of their non-Mario content back then, and ever since they've managed to maintain a steady drumbeat of news in the drops to Nintendo Today or in bespoke presentations, such as the one for Tomodachi Life. At the time of recording, the next few months are now mapped out with just a conspicuous and probably Star Fox-shaped hole in June. These aren't games that have been newly dropped, though. They're just delivering on pre-existing revelations for the most part. Tomodachi Life and Rhythm Heaven from the March 2025 Direct, Splatoon Raiders from the Shadow Drop trailer last summer, and Yoshi and the Mysterious Book from the September Direct. Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition Nintendo Switch 2 Edition was a bit of an exception, arriving at short notice, and of course, there is the chance of Star Fox, but generally speaking, we have just been fleshing out announcements which were already made. However, Nintendo is now running out of road. I do think it's plausible for them to drop a Fire Emblem Direct and presentation to reveal the date of the new game, perhaps dating it for as soon as August 2026, thereby staving off the need for a full new presentation, and I buy that Star Fox short notice presentation rumour and June window to capitalise on the film hype cycle. However, I do think we're moving into a new phase, and this will demand a fuller direct presentation. And when I say a new phase, I think we're looking at what I'm going to call a tiers and tentpole strategy. So what do I mean by this, and how is it different from what came before? Well, if we go back to the origins of Nintendo Direct presentations, they all began as a way to energize their core audience. Long-term revelations, comedy skits with in-jokes about Mother 3, all of these were designed to touch base with their core audience and keep them invested as they transitioned from the DS to the 3DS, from the Wii to the Wii U, and ultimately from the Wii U and 3DS to the Nintendo Switch. Often, the more loose-lipped Nintendo was with its future plans, the more anxious they actually were, with them revealing more long-term plans for the Wii U and offering a fairly massive 3DS presentation in September 2016 on the eve of the Switch's announcement, all to reassure people that the systems that they owned would not be rendered obsolete for a while yet. It was this presentation in September 2016, in fact, that made me think there was a decent chance there would be a Switch 1 presentation before the Switch 2 announcement in early 2025, as indeed there was. The March 2025 presentation may have been overshadowed in some respects by the Switch 2 reveals the following week, but announcing a massive title like Tomodachi Life, as well as reconfirming hype titles like Metroid Prime 4 and Pokemon Legends ZA, were projected for the Switch, clearly showed that the company was going to keep the Switch alive and prove they needed to keep up the perception of the strength of the prior console, because if Switch 2 had faltered out of the gate, they would not have wanted to have alienated their existing massive install base. Generally, though, the direct schedules in the 2010s were not dictated purely by Nintendo's strategy, but largely by necessity, I would say. The long-running E3 event meant they needed something locked in for June that would compete with other revelations from other companies, and they liked to have a big blow-up before their holiday season, so September made sense for a further presentation, as increasingly became the case during the Switch era. Because of the Switch launch reveal in January, a similar January 2018 blowout was widely expected that year, and since Nintendo frankly didn't have much of a game lineup to justify that, they papered over the cracks until June 2018 with a Nintendo Direct Mini in January and a General Direct in March. But by February 2019, they were able to communicate strength by establishing large planks of the lineup that would support Switch Lite, and so it was time for a much fuller flavoured Direct. I've mentioned before my speculation that Nintendo tend to time the reveal of certain types of games for when they do, less because it would be nice for fans to know what's coming up, but more because they want to return to them imminently to showcase hardware. That was the case with the reveal of Zelda Link's Awakening, the Direct prior to the summer reveal of Switch Lite, and with Metroid Dread and the Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel being given gameplay footage right before they dropped a trailer for the Switch OLED. They want the game to be new and exciting, but not so new and exciting that it eclipses headlines about their new hardware. Again, I'm not sure I see any of this as a grand strategy so much as working backwards from necessities, with the default increasingly being to keep quiet if possible and allowing their game developers to cook. They must have learned from Bayonetta 3 and Metroid Prime 4 that very early reveals are gigantic hostages to fortune. I think they had become happy with a 12 to 18 month hype window for their major games like Splatoon 3 and Animal Crossing New Horizons, early enough to generate excitement, but late enough that they weren't unduly pressurizing the developers to meet a deadline that might slip, something that was a perpetual difficulty not just for Nintendo during the Switch time with Metroid Prime 4 and others, but significantly before the Switch. Indeed, it was considered something of a minor miracle at the time that they were actually going to be on time for all the titles they released during 2017, although I rather suspect that Monolith Soft especially felt some delivery pressure for Xenoblade Chronicles 2 not to be the title that broke that pattern, given the patches made to that game after launch. And of course, they went back to delaying games in 2018, with both Yoshi's Crafted World and Fire Emblem Three Houses being delayed out of that year and into 2019. In 2020, due to the pandemic, Nintendo became used to keeping quiet on forthcoming titles, but also the Switch machine was selling so well they simply didn't need an event to spike sales. They were already struggling to produce enough machines even to meet their existing demand. So, what changed? Well, a few things. Firstly, I think they saw in 2017 the effect that a really focused run could give them. In October 2016, they teased Switch, and then in January 2017, they launched the machine with a press conference and a very dense lineup of games, and then they stunk the landing of not just the launch in March, but a succession of games through to December without a single one slipping. This is tricky to manage, though. Secondly, COVID and the mitigation efforts made in response. It feels decently likely to me that the Direct in late March of 2020 would have been earlier under different global circumstances, especially since COVID-related delays were affecting their manufacturing base in China weeks before it affected Japan and the rest of the world. Through 2020, Nintendo, at least for a short period, inaugurated a new tradition of very short notice information drops onto social media. Paper Mario the Origami King was revealed only weeks before the game launched, and this was a fairly consistent pattern for 2020, with only Super Mario 3D World's 5-month hype window significantly breaking that pattern. Related to COVID, the loss of E3 certainly had a big impact on the gaming landscape, and while Nintendo have tried things like Nintendo Live, and there are obviously other shows that have similar status, such as Tokyo Game Show, it feels like the world has moved on. Another big change was Nintendo's newfound financial success, which is really only something that has kicked in during the 2020s and which surely has helped give them the leeway to be intentional rather than responsive with the way they set out their wares. COVID had forced them to experiment with other structures anyway, notably the Partner Directs, which I suspect originated as a way to fulfill contracts for scheduled game announcements without diminishing the value and impact of the general Direct brand by having underwhelming presentations in sequence. However, I think the decisive change was probably 2023. In certain respects, this might seem odd, as 2023 is the most recent poster child of the classic format of thrice yearly and more or less equally spaced directs. However, it also proved definitively that Nintendo could make the weather all by itself and wasn't reliant on a holiday season to deliver a major surge in sales. The 1-2 punch of the Super Mario Bros. Movie and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom in the April to June quarter led to an absolutely massive quarter that year. So massive, in fact, that during 2024, headlines were flowing about how Nintendo was crashing out because its quarter-on-quarter results seemed to have taken such a huge tumble. It wasn't that the 2024 spring was especially terrible historically, it was just that 2023 had been so absolutely vast. Evidently, the key thing here was the presence of the Mario movie. Now, when I talk about the movies being particularly important to Nintendo's strategies, I don't mean this in the sense that they're pivoting the games to meet the requirements of the movies. However, these are massive advertising events, and so it's only natural that Nintendo will want to utilize these movies to their greatest extent. Moreover, this now activates a far more complex web of deals and arrangements than in the past. The movie-ish is the tip of the spear of a vast marketing effort across all sorts of spheres, from toy lines to Happy Meals to goodness knows what else. Nintendo can't just use a Direct as a stick to poke its audience awake when it's worried that their hype bubble is dipping. These events have major financial and potentially even significant legal implications if Nintendo has sought to leverage the prestige of the Directs to gain favourable contracts with partners if they advertise their wares using that platform. I think the first sign of a change was in 2024, when Shuntaro Furukawa pre-announced firstly that Nintendo was working on a sequel to Switch, secondly that there would be a major presentation in June 2024. By most standards, the June 2024 Direct delivered, but it was the only general Direct for the 9-month window that followed. However, it wasn't the only way that Nintendo sought to announce games. In the summer of 2024, Nintendo sent tongues a-wagging by revealing a suitably sinister-looking trailer for the Japanese spooky season of August, which of course ended up being a trailer for one of my favourite underrated classics of recent times, Emmy of the Smiling Man Famicom Detective Club. This unusual approach sparked attention at the time, but I think in retrospect you can see them trialling a different kind of engagement strategy, one that posed a mystery and then resolved it a little later. Nintendo effectively repeated the same trick in 2025 with the release of the Close to You Pikmin, short in both Pikmin Less and Pikmin Full variants a few days apart. In other words, the Direct was not the final word on the year's marketing, but rather the opening shot. That October we got even more reveals, and big ones too. Alamo, the playtest game, Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition for the coming March. At the time, many people speculated that they had a Direct in mind, but Nintendo decided, for whatever reason, it wasn't strong enough, and so they carved it up into a series of mini announcements, but with distance and perspective, I'm less sure about this. During 2020, Nintendo would drop trailers when they felt confident that they were going to be able to meet their schedules, but in 2024, things were quite different. There was a much greater feeling of these announcements being deliberately daisy-chained together to create a compulsion for people to keep coming back to Nintendo. And that is very explicitly the aim of Nintendo today. I mean, the name kind of gives it away. They want people to check in today with Nintendo on that regular basis, and they want to fire up the synapses with those variable rewards, which make the gambling industry so much money and, of course, drive so many of the apps that we all use. Although I see a lot of people being negative about Nintendo for choices which I often think are quite reasonable or explainable in many respects, this is an example of a choice I'm rather more mixed about, but irrespective of my own views, it is obviously effective. In a world of algorithmic content generation, it's not enough to spike attention once, but you want to demonstrate to your algorithm of choice, whatever it may be, that your content is sticky and addictive for it to continue to be recommended. Hence, June 2024 was a massive thunderclap event with a well-regarded direct, and then in the shadow of that they used July, August and October to drop in a series of smaller, weirder surprises to keep people engaged through to the holiday season, which was their major sales window. I would argue, though, that everything fell into a single tier of what could be described as their 2024 marketing strategy. Obviously, Nintendo knew in June 2024 that they were going to be releasing Neo and Xenoblade Chronicles X. In X's case, they didn't have another major title for 2025 until potentially Metroid Prime 4 came out, which in the end they weren't able to drop until December 2025 anyway. In the case of Emio, it was releasing only weeks after the June Direct. I'm sure they knew their plans for Alamo at that case as well. They could have front-loaded this stuff, but not doing so had certain significant advantages. For one thing, they were able to test out a different strategy, something I feel they were doing at the time, and now I feel almost more certain was the case. They also, as I noted back then, needed to spike attention in October particularly. The reason for this might seem odd, but it relates back to 2021. In 2021, they launched the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack in October, and anyone who upgraded at this point had their membership start date reset. This meant that a huge proportion of their core audience had their renewals coming up in 2024, and Nintendo had just cause to be worried that the wait for Switch 2 might leave people to turn off Nintendo and junk their membership, which of course was a major source of reliable income and was going to be the solid base from which they hoped to build the Switch 2 audience as well. As it turned out, membership did take a dip, albeit a very minor one. Initiatives like Alamo being exclusively available for Nintendo Switch Online, at first at least, and the playtest being available to expansion pack members were great ways to highlight the value of the service and keep it feeling relevant. If this whole period from June was all part of a coherent long-term strategy, a single tier in their marketing approach, this pretty much wrapped up in October. The next revelation of much substance was in January 2025 with the reveal of Switch 2, and even then Nintendo maintained almost complete radio silence until the March 2025 Direct. Just like the June 2024 Direct, the April 25 Direct was pre-announced by weeks. The March Direct was a surprise but allowed them to take control of the conversation as hype built, while also, as I've mentioned before, making a point about the continuing good health of the Nintendo Switch system, even though a sequel was in place. Putting the two next to each other created another massive event, but this was really only the beginning of a broader sequence. Notably, we had a succession of other reveals from movie news, like about the Zelda movie, and having a Splatoon Raiders unveiling in the weeks that followed, to say nothing of innumerable live Switch 2 events in the run-up to that massive launch of the machine, and then the similarly huge launch of Donkey Kong Bonanza the following month. It strikes me that 2024 was almost a dry run for 2025 in this respect, a pre-announcement of big news to come a few weeks early, then a major push with a massive general direct or two, then a 4-month window of consistent smaller drops and activity including new game announcements all timed to climax at their major sales window, in 2025 the June release of Switch 2, and in 2024 the October holiday window, which was also not coincidentally the time they needed to make a pitch to Nintendo Switch Online subscribers. In both cases as well, they weren't focused on long-term announcements, but rather on fleshing out the titles for about a 9-month window. Also, there's a similarity in the types of games mainlined in the direct presentations and those that were revealed after. June 2024 gave us Mario and Luigi Brothership, Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, and Nintendo World Championships NES Edition. These are all what I would describe as major titles with more of a casual appeal. Obviously, Nintendo World Championships wasn't the most massive game in terms of its scope, but it did have an older audience and likely, given the special edition particularly, made a relatively large amount of money compared to the cost to develop it. On the other hand, Famicom Detective Club and Xenoblade Chronicles X are definitely more niche propositions. Now, Splatoon Raiders is a different kettle of kelp because Splatoon is a major property for Nintendo, but even then, its appeal is principally Japanese and it definitely has a loud and vocal fan base. When compared with Tomodachi Life, Mario Kart, a new Sakurai-developed game, and even Donkey Kong Bonanza, which Nintendo were obviously trying to position into the big leagues, you can see why they might have felt that Splatoon was the title that would be a better fit for a reveal outside of a main direct. It was a big enough deal to feel commensurate with a Switch 2 launch window reveal, but would also activate a big surge of discussion and buzz from the relatively niche and disproportionately young and social media savvy fan base of the Splatoon series. Plus, it might simply be overlooked if they had put it with the other games in the April Direct. But two swallows does not make a summer, and the September Direct might seem to cut against the pattern that was established with the June and April Directs the previous years. But does it? Nintendo's Augusts are often quite quiet, while Dragon Drive and Kirby and the Forgotten Lands Nintendo Switch 2 edition did make August 2025 a relatively high-profile one by the standards of the company, who in recent years frequently haven't put out a game in that month at all. It didn't feel like they were putting their foot on the accelerator during this period. Now, Masahiro Sakurai focused on Kirby Air Riders during a dedicated direct, and the Pokemon Company did their August thing, and there was a partner showcase and an indie world, but it felt to me that the momentum of April had pretty much dissipated from a first-party point of view. Moreover, if the 2024 holiday window was the focus of the tier beginning with the June 24 Direct, and the Switch 2 launch was the focus of the tier beginning with the Spring 25 Direct, the target of the September 2025 Direct was obvious: the Super Mario Galaxy movie that was launching the following April. This was, of necessity, a slightly longer tier than we have been used to so far. The Holiday 24 and Switch 2 launch tiers were both aimed at sales windows about 4 months hence. The Galaxy movie was for one 8 months away, although obviously did include their sales proposition for the holiday window as well. However, there are particular extenuating circumstances here. Firstly, the 40th anniversary of Super Mario Bros. Falls in September, and while Nintendo can appear inconsistent with their anniversaries, such a major milestone for their biggest star on the eve of a major movie was always one they would want to cultivate and make the most of. The double window of the holiday season and the movie run-up was best served here by introducing a significant suite of games that would sell for both the Christmas and the movie windows. They made this work by having a very consistent drumbeat of reveals across late 2025 and early 2026, including Nintendo Switch 2 editions for Animal Crossing New Horizons and Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, and less high-profile updates to Donkey Kong Country Returns. The Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Animal Crossing New Horizons is arguably the more commensurate in scale to Splatoon Raiders and Emio. Emio, of course, was small in absolute terms, but fairly big in the context of the 2024 Switch lineup, which didn't have all that many original games. And Animal Crossing New Horizons is a huge game for Nintendo, their second biggest seller on the Switch, but this was actually a fairly modest innovation and mainly recycled material from the Happy Home Paradise DLC. In many respects, I'd have expected the Animal Crossing reveal to come in the September Direct and Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave to be dropped a few weeks later, but I think Nintendo is sensitive enough to the response of the audience that it realised it needed some kind of core audience hook in a Direct and a fully original game for anyone ambivalent about the Mario offerings, which, of course, Fire Emblem provided. It's also the case that pragmatically, the Mario promotional window is always going to be a huge one with more merchandise, more tie-ins, more considerations than ever before. As I alluded to earlier, I think Nintendo is now oddly quite a bit less free to make major announcements as it has so many other considerations. This is where Nintendo Today comes in. Unlike social media drops, Nintendo Today is a way to ensure that Nintendo keep its core audience locked in, and so the surfeit of short trailers and extra material has to help keep people interested enough to check in. Given that they were driving this with cinema check-ins and collectible cards, it's logical to ensure that Nintendo Today also has a fairly strong showing in April and May, and the Splatoon Raiders and Yoshi trailer drops in the week of the Japanese film release feels like more than mere coincidence to me. If This is right. I think we can have every expectation of the same broad strategy repeating itself into the future. We are soon to be entering what will basically be a tier 4 of this strategy, but I think it's a tricky one this time. We know they have a major tentpole event coming up, specifically the May 2027 release of the Legend of Zelda movie, and almost certainly built up based on the 40th anniversary of the game. All the pieces are in place. Zelda is 40 this year, but Nintendo has often in the past managed to shunt the celebration to June or September. They even have a title in Fire Emblem that might benefit from standing next to a big Zelda push, just like Kirby Air Riders and potentially Star Fox might be intended to benefit from the Mario effect in 25-26. However, when do Nintendo plan to start this big Zelda push? While Mario could just about support an 8 or 9 month window with a film in the middle, it's frankly difficult for me to imagine them sustaining a focus on Zelda for even that long, but let alone a longer run. But that might have to happen. After all, if they have a big holiday Zelda game, then it's unlikely that it could be announced much later than September, and even that might be pushing it. This would mean a 9 month window to the film release, and of course, Nintendo will want to ride the film's release window for a few weeks at least. I've speculated before that a July 2027 presentation may be in some respects more likely than a June 2027 one, given that the film will only launch in early May and may not even hit all of their major territories before the end of May or June. Does Nintendo's Tier 4 therefore stretch for the whole of next year, and how would that even work? My guess is that Zelda alone is too risky to sustain such a long hype window, but the Zelda movie plus a major new 3D Mario might work very nicely. However, let's consider the way these tiers and tentpoles seem to be operating. With previous tiers, there has been some kind of lull or fallow period between, a period where Nintendo mostly focused on indie showcases, partner directs, and smaller game releases. Tier 1 was queued up with Furukawa Switch 2 and the Direct announcement in May 2024, started in earnest with the June Direct, and ended in the Nintendo holiday window with Super Mario Party Jamboree. Tier 2 pretty much started with the Switch 2 and Direct announcement in January 2025, and ended with the release of Donkey Kong Bonanza in July. Tier 3 started with the Mario Anniversary in September 2025, but when will it end? I'm not convinced they're done with Tier 3 at the moment. The Mario movie has only just launched in Japan, and there'll be the digital home release to come soon. The first movie's digital release shadow dropped in May, and it feels plausible that the same could happen here. We already expect a big Star Fox reveal that will make hay into June. As long as the film is doing well for them, Nintendo may be reluctant to capsize that momentum just yet with a single massive showcase when they can still ride the hype wave with a number of smaller reveals. However, I do think that they would like something significant to give the year shape. The reveal and very prompt release of a niche but very significant and now quite high profile property like Star Fox, followed by the release of a major game in a popular series like Splatoon Raiders, certainly feels like the kind of denouement to the summer that Nintendo could want. If they drop Star Fox news prior to the May investor briefing, and perhaps have the game dropping around the time of the digital release of the Super Mario Galaxy film, then so much the better in terms of them maintaining their high profile while delivering solid material to the punters. Indeed, if Nintendo wanted to add in another couple of info drops, perhaps if they did a Fire Emblem Direct to fuel the hype train for Fortune's Weave, well, they could easily project confidence into September without relying on a general Direct. But it's conspicuous that at the present time, Nintendo have got absolutely nothing locked in for the holiday 2026 quarter. There are risks to this. Nintendo isn't usually this withholding about their year-end lineup, and it's rare that games of any great significance are saved until too late in the day. It's true that sometimes we've waited until June, but generally not much further. It's not unprecedented though. Ring Fit Adventure springs to mind as being revealed very close to launch, but I would expect Nintendo to want to set out their wares for the holiday window a little bit earlier. However, all of that is assuming that holiday 2026 is their big target. This is largely driven by the US market's Thanksgiving, holiday, and the Western Christmas gift-giving season, but holiday sales were fairly anemic across tech, particularly video games in 2025, and if Nintendo doesn't have the strongest slate of games to hand, they may think their better bet is to rely on their vast existing library, including Nintendo Switch 2 editions and other accessories such as Amiibo, and then try to make a bigger impact later on by kicking off Tier 4 in style close to the holiday window itself. So let's say that Nintendo's holiday lineup consisted of Fire Emblem in September, Zelda Ocarina of Time, and a new Mario Artist game in October, plus Luigi's Mansion 3 Nintendo Switch 2 edition, and maybe something like WarioWare in November, and let's say Brain Training in December. This wouldn't be an all-time holiday, but I think Zelda and Mario would hold their own. But the question is, do you need to start hyping up for such a holiday as early as June? I think not. Ocarina of Time has name recognition to spare. Mario Artist is a casual property, more in the vein of Ring Fit Adventure, and WarioWare and Brain Training are smaller deals anyway. I'd argue you could probably announce a Mario title in June as a big reveal, perhaps prior to the annual report. Obviously this depends on the scope of the project, but something from the core team. Mario Maker, Mario Artist, even another Super Mario Bros. Title that utilises the Galaxy mechanics, if they think they've now sucked the marrow out of Wonder, would be the kind of scale that we'd need in order to have something respectable to follow up the movie, if not something quite as massive as a 3D Mario would be. Mario Kart DLC might also work for this, but that would be more of a long-term bet, as it would be limited to the admittedly very substantial Mario Kart install base. Luigi's Mansion 4 would also fit the bill, although I remain skeptical about this being deployed just yet, even though I do concede that next level games are, by their standards, well overdue for a release, and is the kind of high-profile marquee game that would solve a lot of problems for the big N right now. It just feels a reach that we don't clear June without at least something for the holiday window being revealed, but I just don't know they need, and perhaps they don't especially benefit from, a Nintendo Direct at this junction to do it. I've long been skeptical about them going down the route of launching the Zelda 40th anniversary as early as June, and I think the same applies here. I think it's something that could, and perhaps should, be saved for September. If Nintendo are going to use the hype of a general direct to launch their next tier, with the Zelda movie potentially alongside the next 3D Mario as two major tentpoles, does a June 2026 direct really make sense for this strategy? I think it's easy enough to sketch out a competing version of what the next few months could look like without a direct, where they can keep a steady drumbeat of attention going off the back of the movie. Before the May investor meeting, they announce, as rumoured, Star Fox due June and the home version of the film. Sometime in June, they launch a Fire Emblem Direct for Fortune's Weave and give it the date of August or September, and perhaps we get a Nintendo Today announcement of a new Switch Sports as rumoured. Before the June annual report, Illumination confirms they're working on a Luigi's Mansion film for 2028, and Nintendo announces this alongside a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Luigi's Mansion 3 for this holiday. Things start to quieten down on the first-party front in July, with the build-up to Splatoon Raiders taking over, so Nintendo pivot to some other summer fare. Indie World's partner showcases, a Duskblood showcase, Pokemon Presents. There has to be a non-zero chance of a Pokemon game for this holiday, although I find the Pokemon Company harder to read than Nintendo, as I'm not all that tied into their antics. Perhaps, though this is a topic for another video, they don't completely blitz past Metroid's 40th in August, but do a mini-event centered on that. Announcing Metroid 6 for February might be a pretty rad way to celebrate Samus's birthday, and if they celebrate the spooky season of Obon with Emio the Smiling Man, perhaps they'll consider Samus's monster hunting antics also suitable for that window. In the August investor presentation, by which point Nintendo will almost certainly be asked about the lack of a general direct anyway, they can preempt concerns, as they've done in the past, by announcing that there will be a general direct in September 2026 that will set out Nintendo's plans for the end of 2026 and going into 2027. They could even include confirmation that this will address the Zelda 40th anniversary, and possibly, if they're feeling squeamish about their numbers, confirm that it will include details of the next new 3D Mario game, which, as I've said before, is a sufficiently market-sensitive event that I think Nintendo may feel it worth confirming to investors in terms. What's in the general then under this scenario? Well, not everything, but the biggest profile things in the main. The Zelda movie, the Zelda theme park area, Ocarina of Time, perhaps a Zelda smartphone game, and probably at least one other Zelda release for early 2027, A Link Between Worlds or Age of Imprisonment DLC, both seeming plausible candidates perhaps. Then a Mario October game and a tease for the next 3D Mario at the end. It would also be a good place for smaller titles that wouldn't really get the requisite attention elsewhere, such as WarioWare, and I imagine they'll want some kind of significant statement game that shows their commitment to Switch 2 and which might appeal to the older Zelda audience, likely something from Monolith Soft or perhaps Platinum. Of course, another option is to do what they did in 2025 and do two back-to-back or near back-to-back presentations. They obviously wanted Switch 1 and Switch 2 to get their own separate time in the sun in 2025, and perhaps they will feel that Zelda and Mario deserve the same in 2026. So they could do the Zelda 40th presentation and the General Direct a week apart or even a couple of months apart. One presentation for Mario Artist, Monolith Soft's game, WarioWare, Metroid, and an end with 3D Mario. Another presentation for Zelda's film, theme park attraction, smartphone app, merchandise, and games. Either way, they then could double down across October, taking a break perhaps for November and December, where they'll be focused on sales, but resuming in January with a steady cadence of news. A niche, but not too niche, game reveal, maybe Wario Land, but more likely something of the scale of Kirby, a property that is due a big game from creators HAL Laboratory, but where the developers might not want it to share a stage with a 3D Mario launch for fear of being overshadowed. Possibly also some more Nintendo Switch 2 editions, this time focusing on games that will appeal to the Zelda crowd. Astral Chain, Xenoblade, something like that. Then there's the playtest game, which could also make quite a bit of news. The question of where 3D Mario fits into this tier is difficult and obviously not entirely in the control of the team behind the promotional cycles, as the game will be done when it's done. But I do think the 2023 double punch of Mario and Zelda worked very well for them indeed, and I don't think it's a complete coincidence that a major game like Tomodachi Life was released right before the movie launched in Japan. If they follow the Tears of the Kingdom approach, a June or July Mario game would make sense, but I could also see them putting 3D Mario into mid-March to close off the fiscal year strong before pivoting to their final approach for the Zelda movie thereafter. The Zelda movie would be the climax of Tier 4, but just as with the Mario film, I could see them trying to ride the hype wave after that for a period of time. Finally, we'd be then moving into Tier 5, potentially with a July tease for a Switch 2 Lite model with Pokemon and the promise of a September showcase to explain more about their plans for 2027 to 28, plans which I imagine will climax with the release of Animal Crossing in 2028 if it is anywhere near ready, as well as having some kind of significant Zelda release to follow the film. Of course, maybe I'm wrong and they do have a plan for a June presentation that is completely separate from any other of their considerations. I was wrong about September 2025, so I freely concede it's very possible I'm wrong now, especially given that it is likely that they are massively overdue and they do have gaps which they need to start filling. For a long time, I've thought that June is the most likely date for them to be releasing more information, and we still have to give quite serious consideration to the fact that they will want to have something significant to anchor their release schedule at this point. Now, I'm skeptical that they would mainline Zelda for reasons I've given, but I could see a 2 Direct strategy working where the June Direct is basically the Mario Direct and the September one has Zelda's 40th. Even if June is thin on the ground with games past December, this probably doesn't matter if 3D Mario is in the mix, as it will be such an incredible hype magnet. Mario Artist, WarioWare, Metroid 6, a Pikmin spin-off, and 3D Mario will be a totally hype lineup if it followed in September with a massive Zelda blowout, including Monolith Soft, Kirby, plus a further reiteration of the previous games, then I could see a 2 Direct strategy working just fine. However, I'd still not necessarily see this as refuting my Tears and Tentpoles theory. It's not like there's a rule where Nintendo can only have one big Direct per tier. If it makes sense for Nintendo to do another Direct, or to do 2 or 3 Directs, then they will do them. But all that said, I do feel like Nintendo's marketing cycles appear to be changing, that they're looking at 9 to 12-month windows and using the general directs not as in previous years as a general update of what's cooking to keep people on board, but as pivots to bring in initiatives that cut across their entire suite of endeavors, not just in games, but also merchandising and smartphones and theme parks and all that kind of thing, as well as to promote new partnerships and probably to pursue new performance criteria within the company. Anything that needs long lead times would go into a Nintendo Direct. Anything that can generate bigger hype as a shock announcement would go out through Nintendo Today. Very big things like Mario, well, that's a perfect thing for a Direct because it anchors it and amplifies the message. Something like Fire Emblem, well, that doesn't necessarily need to be in a Direct, even though it was this time for its own reasons. Now, I don't think any of this means that Nintendo Directs become annual necessarily, but I think at least 8 months between them could become kind of a default, and I think the month after a Direct might no longer be a lull time for news, but exactly the kind of time when Nintendo might seek to press their advantage by boosting some more cult projects while they have people's attentions. This is a different kind of strategy from the one that we used to see, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be any less effective. So in this channel, I try to forecast things probabilistically in percentage terms. The percentages simply reflect my judgment, but using numbers means I can review my accuracy and try to calibrate my judgments for likelihood in the future. Obviously, I make new forecasts over time, but any that I do make are ultimately assessed, so even if these turn out to be wildly off the mark, they will still count and be reviewed. Right now, though, I would say these predictions. 90%, the Mario movie digital release announcement will happen by the end of August and probably, frankly, before the end of May. 90%, there'll be at least one direct or major presentation, Indie World Partner Showcase Pokemon Presents, by the end of August. 50%, there will not be a general direct until September 2026. 30%, there will be 2 general directs in consecutive months or an even shorter window. 10%, there will not be a general direct in 2026. I think that's pretty unlikely, but stranger things have happened. As ever, thanks for watching and do consider sharing, liking and checking out the Patreon to support the channel further. Also, why not check out these videos on screen which pertain to the topics discussed today. Take care, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.